lost and scared, and the future seems unclear. There are times we feel that no one cares, and we can't hold back our tears. So it's time to regain all our strength.
Hey everybody, today we have Mr. Geoffrey Stone. He is the Edward H. Levi Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago. You served as clerk to Supreme Court Justice William Brennan. You've written countless books on constitutional law. You edit numerous publications. Really like a total rock star lawyer. The laundry list of qualifications just goes on. But so to start out our questions, and throughout this, I'd like to invite the audience to, ask their own questions. There should be a question answer box where you can submit some, and we'll get to answering those later. But just to start out, you've had such a robust and prominent career as a lawyer and educator. What influences in your childhood and in your undergraduate years led you to pursue a degree in law? And had there been any other field that you had debated pursuing instead?
Well, to be perfectly honest, nothing led me to a career in law, but fortuity. I was a senior at University of Pennsylvania in 1968. Donald Trump, by the way, was one of my classmates, although I did not know him. And this was during the Vietnam War. And the draft still gave a draft deferment if you went to graduate school. And so every male in my class, except Donald Trump, who purportedly had bone spurs, had to go to graduate school. And I had not been all that interested in economics, which had been my major. I had taken a course in archaeology that had interested me a lot. And I went to my archaeology professor and I asked her if it made sense for me to start a PhD program in archaeology, even though in a year or two, I might wind up having to leave and be drafted. And she said, no, frankly, it wasn't worth it. So both of my roommates were going to law school. There were a couple of good lawyer TV shows at the time. And one thing people said to me was that if you go to law school, even if you don't get to graduate, what you learn there will stand you in good stead no matter what you do later. So I said, okay, I'll go to law school. And I actually knew nothing about it at the time. But after a few weeks, I fell in love with it. And here I am half a century later, still at the University of Chicago and teaching and doing all the things you just mentioned. Wow, so yeah. One thing I give my students advice is don't think you know who you're going to be later. Keep your options open and don't be afraid to try different things.
And so specifically, a lot of your work focuses on First Amendment rights. And how did you develop such a passion in that specific area? And was there any pivotal moment where you decided what and how you would practice?
Well, here too, fortuity played an important role. When I was a law clerk to Justice Brennan on the Supreme Court, constitutional law was a central focus of what lawyers and young lawyers were thinking about, because it was the tail end of the Warren Court, which had been extremely effective at using constitutional law, in my view, appropriately, in a way to change society in important ways. And when I decided to go into teaching, all 8 of the Supreme Court law clerks that year who went into teaching devoted their careers to constitutional law. So I knew that I was going to do that. But when I was a first-year law professor, I started writing an article on equal protection. And I thought that might be the area that I would focus on. But it turned out the article wasn't going anywhere. And I went to see one of my professors who happened to be my First Amendment professor when I was a student. And he said to me, you're right, this article isn't going anywhere, but I have an idea for a topic for you. And it happened to be on free speech. And that set me off in the direction that became the central part of my career. So once again, I have to say that keeping an open mind for opportunities that aren't what you're planning is an extremely important part of having a successful career and a successful life. In particular, free speech does fascinate me. I think it's a fundamental part of democracy. It's how we learn. It's how we understand one another. And it has always captured my imagination as a central part of what it means to be an American.
So with your expertise and knowledge in free speech, what is most important for artists and musicians in particular to understand about their First Amendment rights?
Well, that they too have First Amendment rights. I mean, one of the arguments that had been made from the very beginning about the First Amendment is that it only is about democracy, and that only speech that is explicitly political is protected by the First Amendment. And the question always existed. What about literature and science and music? Are those types of expression also protected by the First Amendment? And the Supreme Court wrestled in some ways with that issue for a while. But now it has clearly embraced the view that all of those forms of expression are protected by the First Amendment, including artistic and musical expression and so on. And I do think that artists of various sorts should understand, and indeed most of them I think do understand, that they have the First Amendment right to express themselves in ways that others might find offensive or otherwise problematic, in the same way that a newspaper or a political candidate would have the freedom to do that.
Mm-hmm. And so another really interesting part of your career, you were appointed to the Review Group on Intelligence and Communications Technologies by President Obama in the aftermath of Edward Snowden leaking government documents. Can you tell us a bit about your experience as part of this group?
So first of all, I should say that I got to know Barack because when I was dean of the law school at the University of Chicago, I hired him as a fellow. Barack was at the time a student at the Harvard Law School. He was president of the Harvard Law Review. And one of my colleagues on the faculty had published an article in the Harvard Law Review and had been very impressed with Barack as an editor. And he came to me and said, we should keep an eye on this guy. When he's interested in going into teaching, if he is, we should be interested in getting to know him better. And it turned out that we just assumed that he was going to be clerking at the Supreme Court and therefore wouldn't be available for several years. But then we learned that he decided not to do that. And in fact, he and Michelle were coming to Chicago. And so I had one of my colleagues contact Barack and asked if he would be interested in talking to us about having a fellowship at the law school. And Barack said very much so, because he was working on a book at the time. And so he came out and he interviewed for a position. And my secretary, who spent a bit of time with him because I was late for the interview, said to me afterwards, you know, this guy is going to be governor of Illinois someday. And it was true in the sense, not that he was governor of Illinois, but in the sense that he had the personal characteristics of someone who would be a brilliant politician. And that was evident.
Set a little higher than Illinois.
Yes, exactly. In terms of the review group, basically the challenge we had is Barack appointed 5 of us coming from very different perspectives and very different experiences, and asked us to look at all of the various programs of the NSA and to evaluate them in a very objective manner, and to write a report, which we did write and publish. It's available if you go to Amazon and look up NSA report, the report's available. And it looked at all of the various NSA programs and made suggestions for changes in those programs. And the vast majority of them were adopted by the president and also by the Congress. But it was a fascinating experience, and it gave me a set of insights into the workings of the NSA and the CIA and the FBI and so on, that it was a real privilege. And I came away, I have to say, with a much higher degree of respect, particularly for the NSA, than I expected to have when I went into all of this. And I found that that was an organization that, unexpectedly for me, was really devoted to making sure that what it did obeyed the law and was consistent with legal and constitutional principles. And that was the thing that surprised me most about the experience.
Just out of curiosity, you know, what sort of recommendations were you making to the NSA? What, I don't know, recommendation were you most proud of there?
Well, one of the ones that was very important and has been adopted in legislation was that the most controversial of the NSA's programs after Snowden's leaks was the program that allowed the NSA to gather the phone records of basically every American citizen. And what that meant is that they obtained the records of phone numbers you called, phone numbers of people who called you. They didn't know who you were. They only had your phone number, every phone number that number called, and every number that was called, that called to that number. And it was in a massive database. And the idea was they were looking for people who were connected to terrorists. And what they were able to do is, if they knew that a particular phone number was being used by a person suspected of terrorism, they could essentially type that phone number into this massive billions of bits of information database, and they could find out who had been in touch with that suspected terrorist. And then they could investigate to see whether there was anything that the government should be looking into. And one of the recommendations we made is that the NSA should not be allowed to hold all of that data. That the temptation of a president like Richard Nixon or Lyndon Johnson, and certainly today of Donald Trump, to abuse that data and to use it to find out things about political opponents, for example. Who were they calling? Who were they talking about what? Was potentially dangerous. And so we recommended that the NSA and the government not be allowed to hold that information. That was adopted by President Obama and also in federal legislation.
Really impressive stuff. So moving on to some of your involvement with the Chicago Children's Choir, you have a long history with our organization, from being a parent of a singer to being a chair of the board. In this challenging time, what do you think is most important for the young people of Chicago to keep in mind?
Well, I think this is an extremely challenging time from at least two different perspectives, from my view. One of them is obviously the pandemic that we're now dealing with, and how that affects individual lives and how we protect ourselves and protect our family members. And I think people have more expertise than I do, but obviously this is a critical moment for being careful. But on the broader question of the moment, I think that our democracy faces at this particular point in time a challenge greater than any that has happened in my lifetime, and maybe greater than any that has happened at least since the Civil War. And that is frankly due to the fact that we have a president who, in my view, does not understand or respect the norms of American democracy, and that the members of his party have, to my amazement, essentially abandoned their commitment to those norms in order to comply with the demands and the wishes of the president. This is basically an unprecedented situation, and it's one that I think seriously does threaten the core values of our democracy. Close to half of the American people now do not understand and do not embrace a set of values and a set of understandings on which our democracy is premised. And that is basically mutual respect for each other, an understanding that we have to be open-minded and to try to understand the lives and the experiences and the values and the ideas of other people, and that we have to work for a common purpose, which is to find the common good and to compromise with one another and not to battle one another. And the way the president, for example, and his supporters have treated the media is a classic illustration of this. The notion of the enemy of the people is really unprecedented and disserving to the core values, and particularly for someone who works with the First Amendment, is shocking to me. And yet it has become a core part of what we are. And I think students today have to understand that they are living at a moment when the basic principles of American democracy are under challenge, and that they have to pay attention to those things. They have to want to learn American history. They want to understand who we are as a people, why we have the views that we do, why we have the norms that we do, and how to defend those norms at a time when they are seriously in jeopardy.
Mm-hmm. And beyond just, having an understanding of our democracy and what's going on with it right now, what are your recommendations for how young people can become civically engaged right now? What are some actionable things for young people?
Well, I think that this is a time in which taking action on political matters and issues on which one has positions, even for young people, is important. What's happened, for example, with the Second Amendment issue, with gun issues, we've seen young people who played a critical role in bringing to the fore their concerns about living in a society in which guns are so omnipresent that their lives are seriously in danger. And I think on other issues, like freedom of choice for women, I think young people who feel strongly about that, on either side, frankly, should make their views known, because they will be coming to a world soon in which that becomes a critical issue for how they lead their lives. And if they believe in the freedom of choice for women, then this is an important time to make that clear by going to demonstrations and by being on social media and wanting to learn about it. And even going to the teachers and saying, we should understand this. What's the history? What did it look like in the past? What was the world like before Roe versus Wade? And similarly with things like freedom of expression and equality and immigration, these are all critical issues. And I think students need to understand that their future will be determined by how we think about and how we act on those issues today. And that they should play a role, particularly as students, But I think one of the critical
Mhm.
challenges we face, I think, is public education and private education as well, has abandoned the central role of history and civics and government that was there when I was growing up or when my parents were growing up. And I
Mhm.
think that not understanding who we are, how we got to be who we are, and how precious and how tentative it is critical for young people today. And they should be asking their teachers, can we learn about this? Can we study this? What was the world like before Roe v. Wade? What was the world like before we had integration of our schools? Not just knowing that there was a bad world, but what was it really like?
Mhm.
That's important for people to know, to understand what they want to avoid happening in the future.
So we're at 5:16 now. So we're going to start going through some of the questions from the audience. Going off of that, one singer asks, despite the state our country is in right now, do you feel a sense of patriotism stemming from our Constitution and democracy? Especially on how you were just speaking about the importance of learning that history. What do you think the place of patriotism is, in having a you know, conscious public or politically conscious public?
I think that patriotism is a positive thing, but it also has to be kept in check because
Mhm.
we've had many experiences during our history in which patriotism has run amok. And where, again, as a First Amendment scholar, to give a couple of examples, during World War I, the federal government uh, rallied the American people to abhor and to suppress anyone who
Mhm.
raised questions about the wisdom of fighting in World War I and who raised questions about the draft and the legitimacy of the draft. And patriotism can go too far. It could
Mhm.
lead you to be bullied into not questioning the wisdom of what the nation is doing. Similarly, during the McCarthy era, where there became this fervent panic about communism, it
Mhm.
became impossible for individuals to speak openly and candidly about their views. So patriotism is important. It's a fundamental part of enabling a nation to succeed, but it also has to be kept in check. And we always have to be open to hearing views that are different from the ones that we may believe at the moment to be true. And that even includes patriotism. Our country does bad things as well as good things. And it's important for us to be open to hearing that and to feel comfortable saying it. But having said that, I think patriotism in general is a positive thing. It enables us to get things done as a country, but it shouldn't run amok. And people shouldn't be put into the position where they're afraid to question
Mhm.
ideas or policies because someone says you're being a traitor. That's not an acceptable way of being a patriot.
For sure. Another question here. What are some of the biggest challenges that you faced working in law?
Um, Teaching on Zoom, which I've had to do now twice, Monday and today. That's probably the most surprising and interesting challenge I've had to face. Um, I don't think I have had great challenges in a negative sense. I mean,
Mhm.
obviously, having a career where you're responsible for coming up with new ideas, with defending them, is always challenging and always difficult. One of the things I've enjoyed about being a law professor is, I guess, three things I've enjoyed about it, I'll say. One is teaching. I truly love engaging with students and attempting to bring to them a perspective and an understanding and challenging them. Most of what I do as a professor is not to teach in the sense of I'm going to tell you what I know and it's the right thing. Instead, it's about challenging the students to think and making them understand different sides of the same question.
Yeah.
And then not telling them that this is the right answer. That's up to them to figure out. But to get them to think and to be critical thinkers and to be imaginative thinkers and open-minded thinkers, that's a gift for the rest of your life. And it's a gift I got as a law student. And it's one of the things I care greatly about continuing to offer to my students. The second part of it is being a scholar and coming up with ideas and information that is novel and that challenges people and gives them new perspectives is very rewarding. And the other thing is being a public citizen. So I've been actively involved during my career with the American Civil Liberties Union, with the American Constitution Society, with a range of other organizations, both in Chicago and nationally, involving civil liberties and issues I care about. And I've also been an advocate on a number of important cases in the Supreme Court, in which I've participated in writing briefs in, for example, cases involving gay rights and abortion rights and the rights of individuals who are prisoners in Guantanamo. And those have always been very challenging and satisfying things to be able to do.
Mm-hmm. So we've got a great question here from a singer who asks, what advice would you give to an African-American female whose dream is to be a lawyer, but unfortunately due to discrimination and oppression in society today, they're a little nervous to go to law school because people may not take them seriously?
I think I would work hard to put most of that behind me.
Mm-hmm.
I think the experience of women, minority students in law school is in some ways challenging, no question about it, but I wouldn't exaggerate it. I mean, I think that I've seen and worked with many minority students and many, many women students over the years. And first of all, I'd say the culture has gotten much better than it was 30 years ago or 40 years ago in that respect. And I've seen these students excel in the law school, go on to have terrific careers. One of my students from a couple of years ago, for example, an African-American woman, is now a law clerk to Justice Elena Kagan, who used to be, by the way, a colleague of mine at the University of Chicago, who I hired when I was dean. But she's now a law clerk at the Supreme Court of the United States, which is sort of the pinnacle of what you could be at that point in your career. And so what I would tell this student, the singer, is it'll be okay. You will face challenges that are different and are greater than many of your fellow students, and that will continue, unfortunately, for a long time. But it also means you can make a difference in a way that's really critical, and that you will have experiences and perspectives that will enlighten others and ultimately will change the law in ways that will make it better and make our society better in ways that you regard as important. And so I would very much encourage you to pursue this career and not to be shy about doing it. It will be a challenge, but you will succeed, and it'll make a huge difference in your life and in the people around you.
So we've got another question from a singer who's interested in pursuing law, who's about to go into college, and she wants to focus her studies specifically on constitutional law. Do you have any advice before she goes off to school?
Well, I wouldn't study constitutional law in college if you want to go to law school. Basically, I think that students should not engage very much with legal courses as undergraduates if they want to go to law school, because they don't need to. They're going to learn all that and more when they go to law school. It doesn't give you much of an advantage. If you're not going to law school, taking those courses, I think, is great. But if you're going to law school, it's not going to get you into law school. Law schools aren't looking for that as a credential. What they're looking for is people who take a range of courses in different subjects, who come broadly educated. And I think the key advice I give about choosing courses as an undergraduate is to take courses that interest you, that you feel passionate about. The courses that are probably most useful for being a lawyer are history, philosophy, economics, literature, science in some respects. I mean, so pretty much across the boards. And law schools are basically, if they're looking at all for a particular curricula, it tends to be a broad and enriching curriculum that lets you come to law school with a general understanding of a range of different subjects.
Singer asked the question that's been on my mind for a while. With all of these sort of changes with how information exchanges in our society today, do you believe that the First Amendment needs modification? If yes, what kind of changes do you wish to see to maintain a safe environment for all?
So I think that the biggest challenge that we face today is social media. It used to be the case that almost all Americans got their news and information from a limited number of very mainstream and responsible sources. It was basically from major newspapers, who were basically pretty responsible, major magazines, some of whom had an ideological tilt one way or the other, like The Nation on the left or the National Review on the right, but they were all basically mainstream and responsible and serious. And from TV stations like NBC and ABC and CBS, with people like Walter Cronkite and Huntley Brinkley, and almost all, when I was growing up, almost everyone got their information and news from those kinds of sources.
Mm-hmm.
And the result of that is that what we got was a pretty responsible and reliable sense of what the facts were, about what the real state of the world was. And there was lots of disagreement about what to do about those facts and how to think about them. But there was a pretty large agreement on what the state of the world was. With the advent of cable, that began to change because cable stations began to be highly ideological in a way traditional radio and TV stations were not. And then, of course, with social media, people have the capacity to get access to only those ideas that they want to hear. Mm-hmm. And there is this self-fulfilling process in which you basically listen only to people who you agree with. And that's very destructive to democracy. And it does pose a real danger. The question is how to solve that. And part of the challenge is that as bad as that is, we don't really want government intervening to, quote, fix it. Because we do not and should not trust government with the power to decide which ideas are acceptable and which ideas are not acceptable. Mm-hmm. Because if they have that power, we know what will happen. They will basically permit those ideas that support them and their parties, and they will prevent those ideas that oppose them. So the real challenge we face at the moment is how to moderate a system that's run amok and really does pose a danger, again, to the core values of democracy without doing more harm than good. And that's something a lot of people, including myself, are thinking about. But at the moment, I don't think anyone has come up with a truly satisfactory answer to that question.
Yeah.
Other than education, by the way. The best solution to this is educating people so they understand the danger in being swept up in an ideological point of view to the point that you aren't even willing to listen to the other side.
So it's 5:28. We're getting close to our ending time. One more question. Can you discuss how law and politics responds differently to two-sided issues like a woman's right to choose contrasted with issues that are like climate change, right? Where it's about what facts you're using versus, how you're using those facts, like you were saying earlier.
I think that, I don't know that there's really as much of a difference even among those issues as you suggest. Clearly, there are many people who believe rightly, scientifically, that climate change is real and is dangerous. And there are others who are not interested in the facts. And this is largely caused, frankly, by large business enterprises who have a vested interest in not allowing the kinds of regulations that would be necessary to further the interest of preventing climate change, because that would reduce their capacities to make the kinds of profits that they're now making. And this is not an unusual problem, by the way. I'm currently teaching a course on the First Amendment, and it's interesting, we were talking about World War I, and it's interesting how much we entered World War I largely because big businesses wanted to do that to protect their ability to make huge profits off of the trade they were doing with England and France, and to stop the German submarines from sinking their ships. And so I do think that the climate change issue is similar to that, and it's not that unusual. On the abortion issue, I think that it really comes down to an interesting conflict. And I should say, by the way, I was a law clerk to Justice Brennan in the year that Roe v. Wade was decided, so I was there at that moment. The opponents to a right to abortion are mostly, not exclusively, but mostly people who I assume sincerely believe, truly sincerely believe from their religious faith that a fetus is no different morally from a 2-year-old. And their reaction to abortion is similar to what mine would be if a state said that, well, you know what, parenting is hard. If a parent decides that having a child under the age of 2 is more annoying than beneficial, it's okay for them to kill it. I would say that's insane. That's totally immoral. You cannot do that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, for people who oppose abortion, I do understand that's how they feel. And I think that they should understand that's not a scientific belief, it's a religious belief. And they should put their religious belief aside, not when it comes to their own lives. If they believe that, they should not have an abortion, and they're perfectly free not to have an abortion. And if the state tried to make them have an abortion, I would defend completely their right to refuse to do that. But at the same time, they should not impose their religious belief, however sincerely felt, upon others. And so I do think it's important in these contexts to understand, where are you coming from? Why do you believe what you believe? And is it something that A, is truthful and reliable? And second of all, is it something you should try to impose on others? And I think on the climate change issue, it's, in my view, pretty clear that there is really important scientific evidence that suggests that we are heading into a potential disaster. And on the issue of abortion, I fully respect the views of those who believe that abortion is inappropriate and is immoral, but it's a religious belief. And in our society, you should be able to act on your religious belief, but you should never be able to impose it on others.
Really enlightening and great stuff. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. It looks like that's all the time we have, so we're going to have to wrap it up. But thank you so much for speaking with us.
Thank you,
really,
Albert, for doing a great job.
Amazing.
Really fun.